Thank you. Living in North Carolina and working throughout the Southeast, I often passed apocalyptic billboards. The judgment approaches, Jesus saves. Or for a long time, it was that date in May 2011 where the whole world was supposed to end. And that particular billboard had this little metal badge, kind of like the Good Housekeeping seal. And it said in it, "The Bible guarantees it." So that was something that accompanied me in my field of consciousness as I drove from one place to another in my many statewide jobs. The upheaval has been so great in the world so topsy-turvy in these last couple years, though, that what I've come to realize in the last few months is that it is the progressive side of religion that is now wondering about whether we are living in the end times. There was an article in the New Yorker last week. It alluded to this with a tongue-in-cheek headline, "How did we come to be living in cursed times?" it asked. A week like this one, when we face some very difficult and unsettling truths, like the fact that October now seems to bring us not just falling leaves and pumpkins, but this ongoing new normal, scary wildfire season. And the fact that it is really somewhat unbelievable to many of us that we are once again talking about the state of our democracy, but that somehow the imprisonment of children and the endangerment of lives didn't warrant this level of discussion. It was a phone call that finally made this conversation happen. It's hard to wrestle with that. So you might, in face of all this, wonder whether it was that fall that I took, the concussion I had last month that made me think that I should talk about hope, or whether it's something else. I want to thank Caitlin, who stepped in to give voice to so many conversations that I've had with people over these last years about what it feels like to be in this world, to be looking at this as the world in which you would be expected to live out a life or maybe not. And so I really appreciate those sentiments because they're ones that are all around us and ones that I think all of us need to hear and ones that many of us are feeling regardless of our age. And yet, it is also important to think about what they mean. Young activist Greta Thunberg is now famous for these words. She said, "I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I do every day, and I want you to act. I want you to behave like our house is on fire because it is." And all of a sudden, hope became a dirty word for many in the spirit of those young activists. Daniel Zwickel here in our congregation suggests that Greta is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah 11:3 that said a little children should lead them, sort of another end times sign, perhaps. Just a couple months later, there was another mass school shooting, and a Thousand Oaks parent said, "I don't want prayers, I don't want thoughts, I want gun control." This anguished mother heard platitudes and empty words when her child's life had been taken by an unthinkable but absolutely preventable act. To have hope or not to have hope was the question. And I've wrestled with this question from all the months since. On one hand, I applaud Greta for naming that empty words aren't going to slow the destruction of our planet, the pace of extinctions, the rising temperature, and the relationships which are increasingly in conflict and turmoil on its surface. And yet, on the other hand, life without hope, especially in these times, seems untenable. What would it mean, I wondered, month after month, as I pondered this, to see hope not as a throwaway line, not as some kind of easy consolation, but rather as a series of daily commitments. What if hope isn't just words to say when you need something to get away from a hard subject you're trying not to think about, but maybe hope could be a way of guiding our choices day to day, hour to hour, month to month, that could help us find meaning when the health news is bad, or when someone we love is not doing well, or when we face sudden loss, or physical pain, or mental health fluctuations, when too many things cost more money than we have, when the knotholes in our Constitution seem too big. How could hope be not a throwaway noun, but rather an active verb? I believe hope could be a verb because the efforts of individual people are part of our view in this faith of how good is created. This can date back to the mid-1500s when that young, very brash, proto-Unitarian physician Michael Servetus decided to start reading scriptures for himself. The printing press allowed that. And he discovered that they didn't actually support the doctrine of the Trinity that was being used to oppress people. Or when William Ellery Channing in the 1700s urged us to heed that small voice inside of us. And then in the 1800s, when our Universalist ancestors tried to create models of right livelihood and right relationship in utopian communities that all failed, but which taught us a lot forward on the way. To the 1960s feminists who told us that we needed to change the use of our pronouns in our hymnals and other places, to stop saying he when we meant we, so we could include the gifts of all. To the Standing Rock protectors, the water protectors, whose individual choices did actually stop a pipeline until greed won the vote. That platitude kind of hope, it says something else is coming from somewhere outside to save us, so let's just wait here with our billboards and wait. But in our tradition, if you hear that recitation I just made, our tradition is that we believe that our individual choices matter and that we all have to participate to release the good of the world. And yet, what is needed to ground that kind of hope is, in fact, awareness and discernment and the connections of relationship. Hope. Could it be a verb? John Kabat-Zinn is often credited for being one of the progenitors of today's mindfulness movement. He certainly was the person who brought his techniques into the medical sphere. He wrote, "Developing a basic trust in yourself and your feelings is an intricate part of our meditation training. It is far better to trust in your intuition and your own authority, even if you make some mistakes along the way, than to always look outside yourself for some kind of guidance." Kabat-Zinn's work has shown us the way that mindfulness and an awareness of what is within us and around us can be calming, and how it's tied to our health. He's done now decades of research, and so many others have followed with him. And he says, to summarize all the studies is the notion that our physical health is intimately connected with our patterns of thinking and feeling about ourselves, and also the quality of our relationships with other people in the world. Thoughts and beliefs that foster hopelessness and helplessness cause a loss of control, hostility and cynicism towards others, a lack of commitment and enthusiasm about life's challenges, an inability to express feeling, and a social isolation, which seems to be particularly toxic. On the other hand, patterns of thinking, feeling, and relating that affirm connection and hope appear to be associated with robustness and health. Through mindfulness, people can understand and approach stressful circumstances like the ones we seem to wake up to every day. He says this leads to health and optimism. Optimists know, he said, that intuitively there are always choices that we can make in life. There is always the possibility of exercising some control over something. They also tend to be able to laugh themselves over things and have a positive sense of humor. In other words, those who are more likely to make active choices out of that hope do not find themselves as paralyzed by despair. I think hope could be a verb. If the physical reasons dictate that we maintain an active relationship with hope, spiritual ones certainly do. The Reverend Dr. Monica Coleman is a colleague down in Southern California. She studies Ideas about God that are really different from the traditional ideas in her African-American tradition. She joins Mark Miller, who is the composer of the piece that the choir sang, in trying to put forward other ways of thinking about what's larger than us. And she came to her work because she was working with people who had experienced a lot of suffering. She was working with victims of domestic violence, and she just really felt like she needed a different kind of expression than the one she was taught in her childhood faith. She didn't feel like she could sit with these people and offer them platitudes like, God has a plan, or it'll make sense in the long term, or even the devil did it. None of this, she said, was adequate or comforting. So what she found comfort in, what she found hope in, what she found power in, was the idea of some kind of higher force that is omnipresent, is always with us, within us, with us in that sense. Not omnipotent, not all-knowing or all-doing or all-directing, but omnipresent, always there. A force that leads us towards love and unity, which process theologians like Dr. Coleman call the lure, which is completely and utterly dependent on the actions of everyday people every day. This greater force is the source of hope, and it's the same source that Unitarian Henry Wyman called the source of good in our last century. He called the process of what happens when we move together to create something new, each bringing our own gifts, the creative event. It's not a passive act, because it requires all of us to show up with whatever we have to give, no matter how small we may think it to be. It requires all of us to choose to engage. It makes hope a verb. Now, Coleman, who, as I said, has a very unorthodox understanding of God, especially from the community from which she came, said that these ideas of good helped her overcome her lifelong paralysis of depression, which she claims very openly. And she said that it's not so much that we have to seek something new, it's that we have to realize that this force for greater good is already all around us, already within us, and then just make the active choices that move towards it and extend it out into the world. If hope is a verb, we set it in motion through the choices we make day to day to be aware and engaged and in relationship with others. Each of us sitting here today has something unique to contribute. And it's that particular special ingredient that the creative process may need to be added into the mix and into the dough. We do it through engaging with each other in good spirit. And if that sounds a little bit like a pitch for our engagement scavenger hunt today, it is. But for this reason, because it's through our engagement and through our action that we connect with one another here. And those connections are very important. They're what bring the salvific quality of being in community together. But through all these interactions in our life, with the people that we love, through the people that we encounter in our weeks, we learn more about ourselves and our gifts that we have to bring. As Kabat-Zinn says, it's impossible to become like someone else. Your only hope is to be more fully yourself. Last week, a group of us gathered for what will be a monthly practice this year, engaging in mindfulness practices on the second Tuesday of the month right here. Those who study such things say that active mindfulness, which many believe to be a foundation for real hope in these times, needs to be developed like a muscle that firms your abs or the exercises that keep our brain nimble. It's something we have to practice, and we're going to be practicing here this year. So if hope is a verb, how do we enter into its field of play? By being aware, by allowing ourselves to be lured towards those choices which create new connections and possibilities. And yes, also by preparing some room, by letting go of false hopes and empty dreams, those things that may have disappointed us in the past. We could wish that the state of human relations was better, that our ozone was healthier than it is. We could wish that our economics were more evenly spread. We could wish lots of things. But those could also distract us from the realities that the greed of the few endangers the survival of the many right around us right now. John Kabat-Zinn says this: acceptance is the first step, seeing things as they actually are in the present. If you have a headache, that means you have a headache. If you were overweight, why not accept this as a description of your body at this time? Sooner or later, we can come to terms with things as they are and accept them, whether it's a diagnosis of an illness or learning of someone's death. Often acceptance is only reached, he says, after one has gone through a very emotion-filled period of denial and then anger. The stages are a natural progression in the progress of coming to terms with what is. They're all part of the healing process. But we often, he says, waste a lot of energy and resisting what is already fact. When we do that, we are basically trying to make situations be the way we want them to be rather than as they are. That wrestling, that bargaining for what is no longer, or perhaps maybe never has been a lot of what we've been doing as a society in these last couple years. Walking through right up to the boundaries of those dangerous lands of false hope and empty promises. They've kept us from engaging in some ways in the real frame of hope as a verb, making our irreplaceable contributions towards the good. And one thing that I think is really important about this is that we might not have room for those new things that we have, those new hopes, if all of our bandwidth and all of our space is taken up by those old hopes that it's time to let go of. Sometimes to make room for the possibility of new good things, we have to clean out some of the old stuff, including the old expectations that remain unfulfilled. And I'm going to share a really small-scale example from my own life. A couple Christmases ago, my kids all pitched in. It was a particularly hard Christmas for me, that my kids all pitched in, and they gave me this giant box. And when I opened it, I discovered that it was filled with individually wrapped pairs of socks. They were really fun socks. They had like puppies and ostriches and snowmen and cardinals. Cardinals are the state bird of the 2 states I'd previously lived in. And over the years, that mysterious sock thing happened, where, and that's like kind of maybe the opposite of the creative power of God. It's the other power, where one sock of every pair disappears. I don't know how that happens, and I really haven't seen a good explanation yet, but it happened. And I was left with a lot of single socks. Now, sometimes I wear them mismatched, but that's really not my thing. And so I put them all in this bag, which over time got plumper and plumper and plumper. And last weekend, I realized that really, this was an empty hope that their vanished kin were ever going to reappear in my life. So I got rid of many of them, and I paused to remember how wonderful it was that Christmas to open that box and see those socks. But I cleared out my stagnant, vain, and foolish hope that the socks would reappear. And then, this week, in 2 separate instances, I got 2 gorgeous and unexpected gifts, and they were both pairs of socks. Now, I probably would have gotten these gifts anyway, but the fact that I had gone through this exercise made me really happy to get these new socks. And I had room in my drawer for them, in the sock drawer. This is a very silly story. But I think there is a metaphor for us in this story, because we have to allow us to entertain possibilities before we can see the possibilities that are before us. When we are aware, when we are willing to discern how best to use this verby kind of hope, we can choose relationship over isolation. We can choose new things and new forms. We are willing to accept what is happening, and then we can recognize that the power for change is within us and our gifts, and not lurking in some unexpected outside force. I truly believe that someday you'll look in the dictionary and hope might be a verb. I hope so anyway. I might even work actively for that. I believe that we can choose to follow that lure towards the good through awareness, conscious choice, investment in relationship, and giving our gifts as we can. Starting after church in just a little while, by the way. And next week, as we host that climate justice summit, which so many people need us to show up for, to show that we're willing to do what we can. It's a world in which we really need strong hearts. We need roses that open. We need to find all of this hope. Perhaps it is time to abandon hope as a sentiment and to recommit to it as a choice after choice way of life. Because the innate good within all of us, that message that our faith gives us, that we are all of value and worth, means that we can trust our own hearts to make the turn towards possibility, the turn towards hospitality, the turn towards being in relationship with one another. We can notice the good, and be willing to let it guide our actions. If hope is a verb, we are its nouns, the actors who make it real. So may we, choice by choice, be the ones to make it so.